So how's everybody tonight? Good. Couple things about me is I tend to run very interactive presentations, which means that you have a handout, which we will probably never get to the end of tonight. Mostly because I'm here to be a resource to you all and answer the kinds of questions you have, rather than just present a whole bunch of material that I think might or might not be of use to you. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions before we get going tonight, just so that I can get a sense of who's in the audience and how a little bit to tailor some of the information I'm going to be presenting tonight. But what's really important to know about executive function, at least from my perspective, and it's probably why there's such a large crowd here tonight, is this is becoming an increasingly, and has been becoming an increasingly important area, both in education and psychology, over about the past 10 to 15 years. It's been studied for a bit longer than that, but we are now beginning to really understand some of the impacts that weaknesses in this area have. And one of the big debates that you probably have heard about that's related to this, we're gonna probably talk a little bit about this, but I'm gonna try and stay away from it to some extent. But ADHD is actually the penultimate executive function disorder. So if you've got ADHD or someone you know or love has ADHD, you're going to have executive function problems. And it's why you traditionally cannot just treat kids or people with medication and expect everything to be okay. And I think you'll understand a little bit more as we go along. But give me a sense here. Who all are parents in the audience of elementary school kids? So we got a young group. Okay, how about middle school? High school? College, young adults who haven't launched. We got none of them here? Oh, we got one. Okay, good. All right. So it's a broad spectrum. One of the interesting things about executive function as we kind of get into tonight's presentation that I hope you will begin to recognize is executive functions start out being are not present in the human brain, and over a prolonged period of time actually become more and more developed. And one of the most interesting things for me as a clinician working with families struggling with all this stuff is they actually present differently in different age groups, depending upon what the environment is asking that kid or is asking an individual to do. And we're going to get into some of that as we go through this. I actually, in the neuropsych reports that I write now, write in the report that my belief is that these skills are more important to success than actually how bright you are or how much intellectual ability you have. You can be an extraordinarily bright person, and I could give you 20 or 30 cases of my practice and be completely non-functional as a human being if you have severe problems in the executive function system. You can go for pretty long times without being discovered, which is one of the other interesting things about executive function. Or you can have less intellectual ability and be more successful because you don't have problems with this. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. One of the questions I have is how many people in here have heard about executive function? Good, so we got a pretty good group. How many know about them or know a lot about them? Smaller group. Okay, hang on, let me open my water bottle. Okay, good. Because one of the things I will do then is I'm going to run through a couple of models of executive function and kind of give you an introduction as well as an explanation to what they actually are. And we'll do some talking about how they play themselves out, both in people who have no diagnoses and in people who do. One of the other interesting things about executive function is you can have weaknesses in executive function and in my world have no diagnoses whatsoever, or you can have a pretty significant diagnosis and the executive functions kind of go across the board in our diagnostic worlds. So they are not limited to or they are separated from all of the different problems that present in our field like anxiety problems, depression, OCD, ADD, etc. You may start to recognize why some of those disorders present the way they do if you have anybody in your family or if you were struggling with them as we get into the executive functions that I identified. Here's something really important. My presentation, I hope, will kind of mimic what I'm trying to help you all understand and probably will be a bit frustrating for you all tonight. in talking to, is it Miss Hamburger, who sets the lectures up? Okay. One of the things that she said to me is everybody's going to be here tonight looking for the answer or the magic bullet to the problems that you're experiencing. And that's not exactly what I'm going to be presenting tonight. I'm going to try and present you with a structure that, in terms of how I understand them, how they seem to work, what the research out there has informed us about, so that you can begin to use them as tools or as strategies to problem solve with your own kids, with yourself as an individual, regardless of what you're struggling with. So one of the first things that I think is really important is, how many people have heard of or read Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People? Good, we got some folks that have read it. His saying, seek first to understand and then be understood, I think is critical if you're going to work with executive function issues and really understand what the needs are of the kids or people who are struggling with them, and then how to intervene. Because these are extraordinarily misunderstood in lots of kids. People familiar with the book Lazy, Crazy, Stupid by Larry Silver? It's kind of dated at this point. That's the kind of misattribution to kids with ADHD that used to be made regularly. There are some of them that are still made regularly. In my practice, it is not unusual for families to walk in and tell me how lazy their kid is, then go on to tell me they're involved in baseball, they're involved in choir, they produce art, they play an instrument, and I'm going, wait a minute, something's not right here. And what they're really talking about is they can't produce work that's necessary for them to get through school, or what's the other biggie? Does anyone want to guess?
Pick up their clothes.
Yeah, they won't take out the trash, pick up their clothes, do the dishes, help out around the house, absolutely. And there's a reason for that, and as we go through this, I hope that will become clear. The purpose of giving you this educational information, rather than just jumping into strategies, is so that you can begin to understand what's really going on with them, because if you do that, then some of the strategies are just going to flow kind of naturally, and you'll be able to create them on your own, believe it or not. One of the things I want to talk about real quickly is also this simple model of how human beings actually operate, or a way of thinking about it. One of the things I will sometimes do with people when I'm explaining this to them in my practice is I'll make them a bet. You have 10 seconds, I want you to cry. If you cry within the 10 seconds when I say go, I'll give you $1 million. Go. Yeah, see, I'm getting some of the same reaction in here I usually get from the people. Does anybody know why that is? And there is a group of people I would not do this bet with. Anybody guess who they are? Did you say actors? Yeah, they know this system. They don't know it probably the way I'm about to describe it, but one of the things that they know is that feelings actually in humans are extraordinarily important because they are a thermometer. And my way of thinking about this, and this is actually called the cognitive affective behavioral model in terms of how you look at human beings, they're a thermometer of what's going on either in that thinking system, an imagery system, or which is also called the cognitive system, or in the behavioral system. So if I hit them on the hand with a hammer, are they going to cry? Could, so they could get their $1 million that way too. Or they can go up into that thinking system and bring up an image or a memory of something very sad that's happened to them, and that might cause them to feel sad and cry, which would be the external behavior. If you can begin to understand how this model works, and this is something I teach in the counseling part of my practice on a regular basis, you're going to see that this model becomes the manner in which you intervene with people. Another thing about this model that's important to know is behavior is also a thermometer. And one of the reasons I say that is because that's how you actually judge the effectiveness of your interventions, is do they work with the kids and families that I'm seeing or that you may be trying to get to do certain behaviors, or do they not work? And if they don't work, it's telling you something is not working right in terms of the intervention, or at least your theory about what's going on with the kid or person that you're trying to help out. So it's another thermometer. There's another thermometer in this system in terms of your internal states. And that's one in which lots of people have trouble, and it's actually an executive function, actually understanding what they feel. What is the most famous answer that kids with ADHD or executive function give you when you ask them how they're feeling? Does anybody know? Yeah, I don't know. How many people believe that when they say it? Yeah, I see the heads going. See, my feeling is lots of times they actually do believe that that actually is what's going on. If they don't have a monitoring system or a feedback system built in, which is one of the executive functions we're going to talk about, they can't tell you what's going on because they're disconnected from that feedback. Anybody ever heard about sensory processing disorders? What's that beginning to sound like now? Problems in the modulation centers and some problems registering feedback in terms of what the appropriate reactions are to those internal behaviors. So once you begin to kind of think about people in terms of them operating from this kind of a framework, you're also going to see that the most recent iteration of the executive function model that I use, which is put together by a guy named Jerry Joya. Anybody know him in the area? Pretty well-known neuropsychologist. He actually runs, I think, the neuropsychology branch in Children's Hospital. He's up in Rockville, Maryland. And he put together an instrument, if you've ever had your kid evaluated, called the brief. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, the forms you have to send to the school, you all as parents have to fill out. The kid's old enough, they get to fill it out. And that's the model I'm going to present to you in terms of what I understand. But what I wanted to try and do is give you this framework or this tool, because we're going to come back to this, and you should have this in your handouts. Did you all get that? Okay. Good. So if I want to change a kid's behavior, and you start thinking about using this kind of approach, what am I going to start doing with them? Anybody got a guess? No guesses? How about if I start changing how they think about what I'm asking them? How do you do that? Come on, you guys are parents. There's probably a couple of ways you do it. You motivate them by taking things away from them, or you motivate them by incentivizing them. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in terms of the effects that those have on human behavior as we kind of go through this. Because I hope to give you a couple of ideas in terms of actual strategies you can walk out of here tonight with and actually use with the kids and people you're dealing with. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what are executive functions, which we've gotten into a little bit, and what do they do. The term or the phrase that's now being used to describe executive functions generally is they are the self-regulatory systems in the human brain. So they are a set of functions that basically help us integrate both external information, internal information in terms of what's going on with us physiologically, our emotional reactions, and what we know in terms of a knowledge base to respond to a request from the environment to do something or a problem that is being posed to us by the environment. And so their job is to pull all of that information together and all of those different brain systems together. And this, by the way, is neurobiologically based. So it is not a part of a human being's character. It's their genetics and how their brain is wiring together. And we're going to get into how this progresses a little bit developmentally so you can understand how it changes. Because one of the other things I've seen that's becoming an increasing problem in our society is we're asking kids to do a lot of things that they're just not capable of doing and expecting them to be little adults when their brains are not formed the same way ours are. Anybody know at what age the human brain actually finishes most of its development? Yeah. Who figured that out first? Do you guys know? It wasn't scientists. Who said that? You get an A. If I gave prizes away, you'd get one. Yeah, insurance companies. Because you can't rent a car until you're 25 years of age. Why they do that is because they look at the accident rates in undeveloped executive function, and they're terrible before you get to the age of 25. How many parents have gone through the process of having their kid learn how to drive a car? Yeah, it's not a whole lot of fun, is it? Especially if you have the added problem of ADD or executive function on top of this. Excuse me. So part of what you're going to hear people talking about, and it'll probably be talked about more and more, is executive function and self-regulation are essentially the same concept. In fact, I saw Russell Barkley talk, not personally, but a YouTube video at CHAD up in Canada. And one of the things that he said is the problem, and you may hear this from one of your other presenters that's going to do more of the presentation on ADD, that ADD is actually a horribly named disorder because it doesn't describe what's going on at all. It's actually a disorder of the self-regulatory centers in the human brain, not a disorder of attention. And for those of you who work with kids or have kids that have ADHD, it then explains why that kid can pay attention for 8 or 9 hours to Xbox or PlayStation or Nintendo, and they can't sit still for 5 minutes and do their homework. Because it isn't that they can't pay attention, it's that they have difficulty modulating their attention when it's something they don't want to do. That's truly what it is. Now, the reason we will never change the name of that particular diagnosis, does anybody want to hazard a guess? No, that's what I thought too. I was totally wrong. Anybody, any other guesses besides insurance companies?
Medical.
No. Mm-mm. No. You guys are having as hard a time as I did. Yes, why? Yeah, there's all kinds of protections written into law at this point that ADHD is a protected class. You actually can be labeled, and I hate this term, but it's the technical term, labeled as disabled, and therefore get reasonable accommodations. If we were to change the name of the disorder, all of those would go away for those kids.
There are kids in high school who try to become ADHD so they can test it.
Yep. We won't get into that, but just as a general piece of information, just because you're diagnosed with ADHD does not automatically grant you extra time on testing. You all ought to know that. So you don't come pay somebody like me $3,000 to test them and walk away extraordinarily disappointed. Yeah, when you don't get that accommodation. There are reasons why that accommodation is given, but that is, ADHD can be associated with it, but it is not always. Just so everybody knows. So anyway, yeah, they're not going to change it because it's taken us this long to get people the accommodations that they needed to be able. And do people understand that accommodations are not an advantage that's being given to these folks? It's actually an attempt to level the playing field so that they can compete in the same way that their peers are. There's a video I probably will not get a chance to show tonight, but it is one of the most ADHD executive dysfunction people I've ever seen. It's on YouTube. If you get a chance to go look at it, if you go to YouTube and type in ADHD is real, it's a probably sophomore female in college that talks about what it's like to live life as somebody who's ADHD, and she's on the pretty severe end of it, and how hard a struggle it is and how hard she actually works to actually fail about 60 to 70% of the time. Yeah, it's really enlightening in terms of giving you a real sense of how difficult the struggle for folks that have these kinds of issues truly is. So if I start talking about self-regulatory systems, you'll know we're talking about executive functions. You can think about executive functions as like the CEO of the brain, the principal of a school, CEO of a corporation. I'm old enough, and I'm not sure many people are as old as I am in this room, but there used to be a great display when I first started talking about executive function many years ago called Cranium Command down at Disney World. That was an adolescent boy running a brain that was just absolutely fabulous because that was the executive center, and it showed all the things that can go wrong when the executive function system is not working. But what you want to think about is it's the part of the brain, or it's the parts of the brain that coordinate everything that's needed to respond to a challenge from the environment. There is a developmental progression to it. We'll get into that and I'll show that a little bit. What's the relationship to getting things done? It's everything. If you have problems in this area, you're going to have problems getting things done. Becoming motivated to do things is a byproduct of having difficulties in this area. And we're hopefully going to start talking about also how do we support people who are struggling with this to get through meeting some of the challenges they have to meet these days. And one of the reasons these executives, we're going to get into each of these in just a second, but one of the reasons that they come in like this is to illustrate a concept, and this is one of the hard parts in terms of why you might not necessarily walk away with a specific answer to what you came in to get an answer for tonight, is if you think about these functions fitting together kind of like puzzle pieces, and you think about that there can be deficits in each of these areas or strengths in each of these areas, and you start putting these together in terms of a pattern of weaknesses and strengths in the individual that's sitting in front of you, you start to get this mosaic that is almost infinite in the number of combinations that you're going to see and the kinds of challenges that a person's having. And therefore, it's really important to understand, like the first slide said about seek first to understand what's going on for that particular person, rather than, yeah, I went to Dr. Savage's executive function workshop, I know these 5 executive functions, must be all of them, let's throw all this stuff at them. Because it really doesn't work that way, or it doesn't work well that way. So it is really important to be able to start pulling these apart and figure out which ones are the ones that are okay, which ones are the ones that are mildly weak, which ones are the ones that are really causing the individual to struggle, and then figuring out how at that point you start to put together interventions or strategies or accommodations to be able to help that person function. So there are a set of interlocking brain functions whose role is to mediate, orchestrate, regulate, and integrate all of the individual brain functions and knowledge base into functional behavior. And functional behavior is kind of what I talked a little bit about before. It's a response to a request from the environment that is constructive and solves the presented problem or task. And there's another way to think about executive functions, that they are constantly interacting both with the external world and the internal world, which in that original diagram, you might want to pull those 3 circles out, because we're going to keep going back to those as we walk through this. Because there's 2 pieces to that are not really well illustrated in that diagram. And that is this kind of internal-external interaction that's going on. The other piece that we'll talk a bit about is if you divide those circles in half, one of the things you're going to get, and this goes way back in my field's history, you're going to get what is traditionally called unconscious and conscious behavior. But because we live in the digital age, we don't talk about that anymore. We talk about what's up on the computer screen and what's running automated in the background. Same thing. Make the translation. So Freud was a pretty smart guy. He didn't have everything right, but that was one piece he seemed to have right. And that has a great deal of importance for intervention, because one of the things you want to do is you want to basically be able to help people externally learn how to develop or accommodate executive function, and then allow them the time to automate those skills, because in somebody that doesn't have problems with that, this stuff just comes online and it works. And it's automated and they don't even really think about it. Because one of the exercises in a lot of the recommendations I make in terms of teaching kids executive function is for the adults around them to start verbalizing what they're actually doing when they are solving a problem on a continual basis, so that a kid gets to see what the heck it is that's going on behind the curtain, if you will, as you approach solving a problem, because they have no clue if they're struggling with these kinds of issues. They don't go through that process. Typically what they do is respond with the first thing that comes into their head, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. So that it's a way over time to continuously help them rehearse executive functions. We really are into, when you're talking about education, the process of how one learns, remembers, thinks, and solves problems, and performs tasks, rather than the actual content of what you're learning. One of the most interesting things is when you start talking about people who don't know as much about this kind of stuff. You may have even done it. I certainly did it back when I was a parent and didn't understand this stuff as well as I do now, is we think that kids who break rules need to have the rules repeated to them so that they will then adhere to the rule. Totally wrong thing to do. Because most times, if you actually stop, and you can do this experiment with your son, daughter, student, and ask them what the rule is, they'll likely tell you. Well, why didn't you pay attention to it? Come on, you know the answer to this, right? Yep, I don't know. And many times they actually don't know. So one of the things I want to make sure that I talk about while I'm thinking of it is there is a rule of thumb that I use, or a principle that goes on behind all the work I do. And most of the work I did as a parent, because I learned about this fairly early in my career as a parent. And that is that I always assume that if a kid can't do something I'm asking them to do, or an adult can't do something I'm asking them to do, it's not because they don't want to do it, it's because they can't do it. And that is a complete change in paradigm for most of us. And probably one of the hardest things that parents work on in the practice. Because otherwise, what you end up with is you've got to create this kid who is laying in bed every night, who is plotting how to make you angry and teed off all day long to be able to create the level of frustration that these kinds of kids usually create in the adults in their world. And unless you've got a kid that has been through lots of negative interactions with adults, that is highly unlikely. They can get there, but it's pretty hard for kids to be in that place. Almost every kid I have met desperately wants to make the adults happy. They just don't know how to do it sometimes, or can't do it, or can't figure out how to do it. Until they get enough negative feedback, and then they learn how to get that, and that attention is better than getting no attention for many of them. Okay, moving on. At this point in the model, I'm going to really talk most about tonight. There are 9 of these skills that seem to interlock and overlap with each other to some extent. And this is what they are. They are kind of done, and I'm going to show you a different model in just a minute that will tie into the model of human behavior I started out with tonight. Starting up here at the top with inhibit. An inhibit is the foundational executive function. If you can't inhibit behavior, most of the rest of these executive functions down here are going to suffer. In fact, is anybody familiar with a kid who's been diagnosed with ADHD, put on medication, and goes basically from a C to D student to getting straight A's, and all of a sudden everything just turns around and they're doing great? They're rare, but they exist. I've had a couple of them in my practice, so I've got one head nodding. Anybody else ever seen that or heard of it? If you've seen a kid like that, this is fundamentally the problem that the medication is addressing. Does anybody know what the medication actually does to the human brain? It increases the amount of dopamine in the frontal regions of the brain. Actually, it does 2 things. It increases the amount of dopamine, which is kind of a funny name for that particular neurotransmitter, since it seems to make kids smarter when they do it, and it really doesn't, but they produce more, so it seems to make them smarter. But the second thing that medication does is it also stimulates the human body if it's given at a high enough dosage. So the other thing to be careful of, and I'm sure the guy that comes and talks about ADHD will talk about this, is getting that dose right, because at some points it will work to inhibit, and at other points it'll start stimulating the kid, and they'll look more ADHD than they did without being on the medication. And in fact, one of the phenomenons I've witnessed is you need less medication as you get older typically. Anybody want to guess why? Which is the exact opposite of what they taught when I first started in practice. Their metabolism runs, little kids' metabolism runs faster, and as you get older, it naturally slows down. And the other one is, as you learn some of these skills and as some of them come on board over long periods of practice, your behavior starts to improve, so you don't need as much support from the medication for the inhibition part. For all the rest of the kids that have, again, the penultimate disorder, that is only the first step in the answer typically, is figuring out how to get inhibition under control. And once you get that under control, then you can take a look at shifting, emotional control, initiating, working memory, organized plan, planning, monitoring task, and monitoring self, and figure out what else is going on and what other strengths and weaknesses somebody may have and where else they may need support. That slide or that part of the slides come up just to remind everybody, this is not that kids don't want to do this stuff. This is not a characterological issue. This actually is a neurobiological way in which these kids are wired, is the way I talk about it. That also has implications for how and why interventions do and don't work that we'll get into. This is the model that Jerry Joya developed and is refined, and now he's got the brief 2 out if you've had your kid evaluated recently. And it's been refined. Does anything look familiar here? Did the behavior regulation, the emotional, and the cognitive, you've seen that before in that model. I told you that if you begin to start to think about how human beings behave and what makes us tick and how to manage emotions, that model is tremendously helpful. Now the executive function model is starting to kind of morph into beginning to recognize that there are different executive functions that control different aspects inside of those 3 circles. I find it an incredibly helpful tool. One of the things you're going to, I hope, get out of tonight is I tend to try and simplify things because this stuff is so freaking complicated. I'm going to show you a model in here that'll blow your mind because it blew mine about executive functions that is probably the most accurate model I've seen so far. But I have a hard time helping parents understand what's in the reports I'm writing now, much less if I wrote a report with this other model you're going to see in just a minute. And it took me a long time to really get to the point I could understand all this stuff and understand how it really worked. So the other thing is be patient with yourself. Read. Far beyond this workshop. Talk to people like me who know what they're doing in this area. Because this is incredibly complicated stuff, but it can be made simple but not easy. Anybody remember who said that in a famous movie? Big Star Wars fan, Yoda. I don't know if you remember it, when Luke was trying to use the Force to lift the starfighter out of the swamp, and he was having such trouble, and Yoda looked at him, simple it is, easy it's not. That's a key to remember walking out of here about working with people that have these kinds of issues going on. Lots of this isn't rocket science once you get it, but it sure is hard work. So this one shows a little bit better kind of what I was talking about before, where this is the inhibit is the foundation. It's the bottom. You got to get that under control, because if you have problems with that, you can't get people to do most of the rest of this stuff with any degree of consistency, because they're always going to have trouble staying focused on what you want them to instead of something else that's out the window or something else in the environment or my tie that happens to look pretty to them or whatever the heck it is their attention starts wandering off to, because they just can't inhibit their thinking. Anybody recognize out of that first model the couple of different categories of ADHD that exist? The inattentive version is problems modulating thinking. The hyperactive form is problems modulating behavior. So we're getting into this model now. Does that make some sense to you? And the combined type means you're really lucky you got all of it. And I'm kidding. Those people struggle the hardest, probably. So in terms of thinking about this, it's also important to recognize where you need to make the intervention, and then look at, you got to make sure these fundamental ones down here are under control before you can get up into the cognitive regulation, if you're going to really experience success. And for any teacher, how many teachers have we got in the audience? We got a couple. What's the first thing you got to get control over in the classroom? Somebody's saying it back there, behavior. Yeah, because if you don't have that, you can't do any of this learning stuff up here. And who are the kids that are most likely to be disrupting that? Yeah, we know. Well, the kids we're talking about tonight, or the people we're talking about tonight, generally. And I don't mean that from a negative way, because I find these kids, families, and people fascinating to work with. They're wonderful, beautiful people. They just have a heck of a time managing all of this stuff. Yeah, what do we got? Oh, here we go. This is the one I was telling you is going to blow your mind, because this is a visual spatial representation of the human brain. And these are all of the different functions that are going on. Yeah, here we go. And look at where the executive functions interact with all of this. But look at all of the processes it's managing when kids are trying to solve a problem. One of the things when I first started understanding this is it made me unbelievably appreciative of how complicated our brains really are. This was put together by a guy named George McCloskey. And hang on, but what he talks about is that there are 32 individual self-regulatory processes that go on in the human brain. Now remember, I'm only trying to get you to think about 9 tonight. He also thinks there are 4 different domains in which they work and 4 areas of involvement. And I'm not going to go into all of that, but if you form a 4 by 4 by 32 matrix and you plug all of the strengths and weaknesses in that a person has, actually what's kind of interesting, and maybe Watson will start doing this for us, you will be able to predict a lot of times what people will do in certain circumstances by understanding how those things are interacting with each other in terms of human behavior. It's actually pretty fascinating. A little bit scary because of some of the implications, but yeah.
What are lexicons?
Libraries of information that you store. So your vocabulary would be a lexicon of words, for instance. And the reason I don't do this again is, this was hard for me to get my brain wrapped around. The other part, I guess I should remember to say when we do this, and this can be one of the most confusing parts for parents, teachers, and people working, or for the individual themselves, is all of these executive functions do not develop in all of the different domains they function in at the same rate. So for instance, somebody could be organized in terms of their thinking and produce written work that's an organized fashion or orally present things to you in an organized fashion, and you go look at their room and it'll look like a terrorist clothes bomb went off in it. Same executive function, but being applied in a different domain. So one of the important things is not to assume is because a kid can organize something or create a plan in one arena or domain of their life, they necessarily can do it in another one. What problem do you think that has led to in our culture? It's a pretty big one for these folks. That problem of executive functions developing differently in different domains.
Hard to figure out.
And what do people assume?
They label them as lazy.
Yeah, the answer was they label them as lazy. That's one of the outcomes, but what's behind that label? What is the person assuming? Bingo, that they have control over it. They may have control over it in one domain and not have control over it in another one. So one of the problems it's led to, and I don't know how many of you have gone through this in terms of having your kid diagnosed and going through that whole struggle, especially early on, it's gotten a lot better recently, is people wouldn't believe that a kid has a problem because they aren't displaying those behaviors in the domain that they're seeing them in. One of the big splits that I see regularly is kids who function tremendously well at school, believe it or not, and are wrecks at home. Anybody got kids like that? Yeah, there is a particular group, and I'm going to show you a slide actually that a kid produced for me, and this was spontaneous, and I'll tell you the story behind it, that was an angel at school, but was a terror at home. And so the parents would go in and talk to the teachers about how are things going at school, yada, yada, yada. Teachers would be saying, oh, he's great. He's a wonderful kid. Parents are going, who are they talking about? So for them, they began to believe, and who wouldn't if you don't understand this stuff, that their kid had control over that and that he or she was coming home and acting this stuff out because they were angry at them for some, and here we go into Freudian stuff, unconscious reason because the kid could never tell them what it was. And the real reason is because they had problems in the executive function. Schools, by their very nature, generally provide what to kids that most homes don't provide as much of. Bingo. And one of the things you'll hear from me over and over tonight is structure is the answer for these kids, providing scaffolding. And the purpose of providing the scaffolding is to help them learn how to work their way through these tasks and apply executive functions with the hope that if they rehearse it long enough, they'll automate it on some level. Unfortunately, we don't have a bunch of them that we started out from birth, kept them in little lab boxes and tried all this stuff on them to see if it would work. People don't like those kinds of studies very much, probably go to jail. Ethical committees don't like them very much. So a lot of this is just clinical experience from talking to lots of other clinicians who work with kids, and my experience kind of watching these kids over time who get this extra support seem to do much better than the kids who don't get the support. It's a little bit unscientific, but studies of one have some value. Okay, here's the other model that's out there. You guys probably know, you've heard of this guy, right? Russell Barkley? Yeah, very famous international researcher on ADHD. I don't like his model as much as I like the other model, but I think there is something important that he has to offer. And that is, are these 5 executive functions. And what's the thing that you notice about this particular way of looking at executive function just by the label? Yeah, it's what the self is doing to the self. That's the self-regulatory part. So it's a little bit clearer in his model that this is an issue with self-regulation. And actually the way he describes it is that as a kid, as a baby, you start out acting on the environment. And the development of executive function is learning to take those actions on the environment and starting to turn them inward and act on the self, so that you start to regulate the self instead of regulating the environment. So over a period of time, developmentally, that's what we think is actually going on. And this model kind of demonstrates that a little bit better. I just think it lumps some things into too big a category when I start thinking about how to help kids or help families start intervening with kids. But that model is out there. Okay, let's start out with behavioral regulation. Inhibit, it's the capacity to resist the urge to think, remember going to the internal part, or behave. That's the external part. Impulsive thoughts are usually those that are triggered by the environment. So let's suppose a teacher's teaching class, they're a competent teacher, but they happen to make a mistake with a particular fact. And you've got a bunch of kids sitting in the classroom, and you have one that happens to be severely disinhibited. Is anybody going to guess what that kid is likely going to do? Yeah, they're likely to challenge, but how are they going to challenge the teacher typically? Oh, not the kids I see. That was stupid, would be a typical response they would say out loud. Why on earth would a kid say that? Because if you sat that kid down and said to him, what do you think is going to happen if you say to a teacher, that was stupid, in the middle of a lecture? Most kids are going to tell you something bad's going to happen. Depends on the teacher, depends on the discipline policy in the classroom. And what I will guarantee you, and this is something that's really interesting to think about, every kid in that classroom had that same thought or some variant of it. It's just they could inhibit it long enough to go, I bet if I say that I'm going to get in trouble. So they don't say anything. They just let it go and go on. So one of the really important things to understand about these kids is they're not weird. They're not all that different from any of the rest of the kids. You just get to see inside of their heads a whole lot of what goes on that's censored in most human beings. One of my favorites is, and it's kind of calmed down a little bit at this point, but about 5 or 6 years ago, I would get calls persistently from schools. You have to evaluate this kid because they just threatened to kill the teacher and kill themselves. And I'm going, yep, it's one of my ADHD kids again. Because they're frustrated over something going on in the classroom. Every kid will think that thought, but most won't say it because they know what the consequence is in school. You get yanked down to the principal's office, you get sent to your shrink's office, you have to have an evaluation, you get to miss recess and all the fun stuff, and then you get sent back to school. And your parents are probably angry at you for having made them go through all of that stuff. It's better today because I get very few of those. So obviously what's happening is in classrooms, people are beginning to understand that there are very few of these kids that are actively homicidal or suicidal and are doing some of this screening and intervention before they ever get to my office. I'll rarely get a call now, but I used to get them all the time. So just remember, they're thinking the same thing as everybody else, you just get to see it. Yeah.
So are they generating more thoughts, or are they just not able to like shut down the thoughts?
It's not shut it down, it's shut down the behavior. And that behavior in this instance would be the shouting it out or vocalizing it. Because the natural state of the human brain, anybody here ever try and meditate?
Ever meditate?
Yeah. You know why they call it the practice of meditation? Because it's really hard to do. Because if you actually get this, if you can disconnect yourself from all of the stuff we pay attention to in our environment, your brain is going at 1,000,000 miles an hour, generating a bazillion different thoughts left and right. It's bouncing all over the place. So it's really hard work to focus yourself, be still, and keep focused on something. And trying to get somebody that's ADHD to do that, who has trouble inhibiting, is a real trip. Now, if you've seen the research out there, actually meditation is one of the more valuable things to teach these kids because it teaches them the skill of inhibition in terms of the thinking part of the brain. And there's actually pretty good research out there now that's suggesting it's actually effective, which is the amazing part. But you got to set people up with the correct expectation. So for instance, if I was going to send somebody home and say, go meditate as an ADHD person, look, if you can be quiet for 30 seconds and think of whatever your mantra is or follow your breathing or whatever it is you're using them to give the focus on, you're doing great. Because if you don't tell them that, they're going to think it's not working and they'll quit and give up. So what's one of the intervention principles you're already hearing come out of me? Does anybody recognize it? Start small, start in little pieces. And start in ways that they can succeed and set their expectations at a much lower level than what I might expect for myself as a non-ADHD person. Because if they begin to succeed, most people will get engaged with the task. If they start failing right off the bat, they want to quit and give up. You get the behavior under control first, then you move to the emotional regulation. And if you actually think about kids going through developmentally, it follows like the Piagetian process that kids are developing through as well. And what's the reason for that? Come on, you guys should know this now. It's the brain. Yeah, it's the brain. It's the development of the brain. What's going on in it that's allowing that kid to be able to modulate that behavior. So they aren't independent. So you don't have to get complete behavioral control before you move to emotional control or complete emotional control before you move to cognitive control. But the more you get that base put in, the easier it is to move to the other levels, is I think the way I would say it. Any other questions like that? Yes? If a person can't complete a task, his question was, how do you know whether it's inhibition or whether it's working memory? And my answer to that, right off the cuff, why can't it be both? Yeah, that's the third option too. So I don't want you to think in either ors, because remember that puzzle and how it goes together. You can get these things fitting together in some really interesting and different ways. And I want to hold off answering that question so that we can get the working memory so everybody knows what it is. Yes? Okay, so the question was, if a kid, are you suggesting have a weakness so they're working really hard at it? Okay, so if they have a weakness in one of these executive functions and the task asks them to deploy that executive function to get it completed successfully, and they're working really hard trying to manage that executive function or regulate it, does that therefore mean they may have problems in other places pop up? And the answer to that question is absolutely. Here's something else to think about. One of the things that I often pay attention to when I see these kids, because I see these kids and families over relatively long periods of time, because this is a lifelong project for them. That's the bad news. if you came here looking for a quick fix for all of this stuff, is that when kids are under stress, all of these things are real problems. So one of the ways to tell that they're getting sick or that something is going on with them emotionally at school, like some kid picked on them, is if they've been doing pretty good managing these skills and all of a sudden they just torpedo and go downhill, that typically means there is some stress on their system. And that gets to a concept I use a lot, which is I think about us as little biological batteries or energy systems, if you will, so that when we go to sleep at night, the purpose of sleep is to recharge us. It does a whole bunch of other stuff, but we don't need to get into that. But it recharges us to have the energy to be able to do what we need to do for the following day. So one of the things that when you do diagnostic workups that's important to ask, and if your kid's been through it, I hope this was asked, is do they snore? Do they have problems sleeping at night? Because if they have problems snoring and sleeping at night, they may have sleep apnea, and none of this may apply, but they may look like this. Does that make sense? Because of sleep's restorative function to the brain. And if your kid's either borderline or is doing okay, but some of them are weak, and they have sleep apnea, they're going to function on all cylinders going into the classroom because lack of sleep is a stress. If something in the family happens, like they lose a favorite grandparent or they lose a pet in the family, you'll see a lot of what people would call misbehavior or dysregulated behavior is what I would call it, start occurring because they're under emotional stress at that point. So one of the things to also remember is there is only so much energy we have to expend on the tasks that we're asked to do every day. And these kids have to expend a tremendous amount of energy just to manage these functions, much less pay attention to the content they're being asked to digest or the work they're being asked to produce. So they work really hard most of the time, even though they don't look like it. Does that make sense? Yeah, but that was a good question. How many people know that these kids typically can pay better attention if they're allowed to doodle or hold a fidget or play with something, and that is not disrespectful behavior? So a fair number do. Yeah, those of us in the clinical end of the field have known that for a long time. Is anybody familiar that there was just a piece of research that was released about a year ago that actually demonstrated this to be true? Yeah, they actually showed that these kids absorb more information if you let them. And it goes back to the other question that was asked, hang on just a second, over here. If you don't have to expend energy sitting still in your seat, guess what you have it available for? Learning, or managing the other executive functions. And actually, this has been known a fairly long time. There was a study at NIH where they took kids who were on medication and ADHD in small classrooms and taught them, and they also took kids and put duct tape around their desk in a circle or some kind of configuration and said, you can do anything you want in that, and as long as you don't call out to other kids, so distract them, or throw things outside of that circle. And the kids that were in that kind of a classroom learned as well as the kids who were on medication in a more normal classroom. These were artificial classrooms. So it's been known, God, it's probably been known since I started out about 25, 30 years ago. Yeah, but it's become more popularly known now.
My question is, and I've had experience with a lot of us at lab, and I've had experience at our former school, why is it not more integrated into any school, not just a school like lab?
I think it's a lack, my personal opinion is it's a lack of resources being put into teacher training. They don't get taught this information. I think it makes perfect sense. One of the things that I have thought about doing when I retire is setting up a course about how to take care of yourself using that simple CAB model you saw, plus a teacher part in terms of teaching teachers about this kind of stuff. It's just I haven't had the chance to retire yet. And if the stock market crashes one more time, it's going to be a long time before I retire. Yeah.
I'll just make a comment. I'm an occupational therapist. I work in Arlington County Schools, and a lot of teachers are really incorporating this. I spend a lot of time providing fidgets and various seating and things like that.
It is getting better. And I think that's actually probably the real answer, is it's coming from the communities like OT, like me, like speech and language, who are understanding this stuff, writing about it in reports, going back to teachers that have kids that are tough to manage and giving, but I don't think it is typically taught in most teacher training programs, at least yet. Now, I'm not in that loop, so it may be at this point, and I just don't know it. Let's talk about monitoring for a minute. It's the capacity to maintain awareness of, and here we're going to go again, in the inner emotional states, the effects of behaviors on others. So these kids sometimes have lots of social behaviors that are inappropriate, don't read social cues very well, partly because they can't pay attention to it, but also partly because they can't monitor what's going on. They can't monitor their progress towards completing a plan. They can't monitor their performance of a task in comparison to others, or whether their behavior meets a set of standards. One of the most interesting things on the brief that I've seen is where parents and teachers will come back, and I'll get this profile that's elevated across almost all of the executive functions. And then I'll get the kids when they're old enough to fill theirs out, which is about 8 or 9 years of age. And theirs is just flat, no problem. Those are the kids that are always answering, nope, no problem, everything's going fine. Come into my office, my report card's great, doing great. Next week they come in, look like somebody in their family died. What happened? I failed 3 classes. And they had no idea that their grades were that bad. What are these kids typically misattributed as doing? And this is one of those destructive things that happens to these folks. Anybody guess?
Not caring.
One of them's not caring. Not trying is another one. Yeah, they're lying. They're not lying. Why would a kid come in and tell me that? I'm not their parent. I'm not going to get them in trouble. I'm going to problem solve with them. That's my role. My role is to make it a safe place to come in and talk about these kinds of things and figure out what to do about it. And yet, it's profound when you see this happen. They just don't get it. They truly don't get they're doing that badly. One of the dangers, if you've got a kid that's like this, of treating them is their life's fine. You'll do some emotional screening typically, and they're across the board looking okay on their screening, not on the parents or not on the teachers. When you start to intervene with them, can you imagine what happens? They get depressed because all of a sudden they realize their life is a disaster when you start giving them the ability to monitor what's going on. So their scale starts to go up to where everybody else's is, and it's overwhelming to them. So part of what you have to be prepared for in working with these kinds of folks, even as a parent, is the better they get at some of this stuff, sometimes the worse they will get in certain aspects for a period of time. And that doesn't mean you're failing, it means you're succeeding. You just have to be ready for it and be ready to support them through the emotional side of it. Does that make sense? One of the issues that I've seen a lot with putting kids on medication is all of a sudden they have all of this anxiety, thought to be the result of the medication. In my experience, that's not true. What they're anxious about is they can now pay attention to what's going on, and they have every reason in the world to be anxious because they're not doing very good. And so then it's treating the anxiety disorder rather than yanking the medication away. So that's something else to be thinking about, particularly as a parent and as a consumer of some of these kinds of services. Monitoring self, they don't know their own strengths, don't know their moods or feelings, can't tell where they are in a plan, unaware of the fact your behavior is not appropriate. We're going to get to shifting in your question in just a minute. But emotional control, the capacity to modulate emotional states, so express emotions that are appropriate to the situation. What are these kids called these days by their peers that have problems in this arena?
Annoying.
Yeah, that's a long-standing term that's been used. Could be crybabies, that's another long-standing one. Not chill, that would be a more modern one. What's another modern one? Clowns, that's an old one. Okay, could be, that's an old one too. Anybody heard of the word emos? emos. EMO. They're an emo. Means they're way too emotional, they're way too dramatic, they can't modulate their emotions. The other one they'll use is drama queen or king. Same meaning. They create drama wherever they go in terms of emotions. And what I want to be clear about is, when we talk about kids that are having trouble modulating these emotions, we're not talking about somebody who would get upset and cry if somebody died, or if somebody punched them in the face, or something bad happened in front of them. That's a normal reaction to something that happens in your world. We're talking about the kids that will fall down and scrape their knee, and all of a sudden it's a major tragedy and they have to go to the hospital. That's the emotional dysregulation we're talking about. And some of this can be learned, because I don't know if, with my kids, I remember this distinctly. When one of them fell down, if I got upset over the fact that they fell down, they would get upset. They'd actually look at you to see what they were supposed to do. And I learned, no, I got to be cool. Just pick yourself up and go on. And they'd pick themselves up, and off they went, and they were fine. So some of this is learned, but some of it also has to do with weak skills in here. And we're going to get to one of those kinds of kids to answer your question. Yeah, there was a question back here, I think. Paraphrasing, I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, she's saying some of the kids that are called emo are also the kids who are depressed, and are depressed appropriately so because they're having so much trouble managing their environments, right? Yeah, that's the other thing that goes on in my field a lot, is lots of kids present. I've actually had kids present as suicidal that needed to be put on a psychostimulant because they had severe ADHD that had just never been diagnosed. And that is really risky, or was really risky for most psychiatrists 10 years ago, because they would rather go the route of treating the depression that's so obvious when a kid's suicidal. But it's all of what she was talking about, where they can't perform, and they know they can't perform, that causes that profound depression in those kids. Because it doesn't matter how hard they try, they're still not cutting it. So I went with the simpler approach and said, let's try this first. We'll give the kid therapeutic support and help the parents know what to do to avert a crisis, because you could get somebody who is actively suicidal at that point actually act on it. But if you give people the right kinds of support, you can intervene with them. And I don't know if people know this, but psychostimulants are one of the safest medications on the market today. In fact, if I had a choice of putting my kid, if I could pick what was going on between an antibiotic and a psychostimulant, I'd pick the psychostimulant every single time. There are no kids that have ever had an anaphylactic reaction to a psychostimulant, and they have them all the time to antibiotics. That's the worst allergic reaction, and there's all other kinds, when it's appropriately diagnosed and administered. Yeah, there was a hand going up over here. Yeah. Yeah, this, just so you know, she was asking how many of the kids that I see, she's got a speech and language background, and she was asking how many of the kids that I see have speech and language issues. Lots. There are lots of kids that have reading disorders. There are lots of kids that have disorders of writing. Some of them have phonological processing disorders. Some of them have speech disorders, articulation disorders. When you get glitches in the neurodevelopmental system, they tend to occur in more than one place. It's rare just to get them in one area. In fact, I think the numbers are about 30 to 35% of the kids diagnosed with ADHD, which remember is the penultimate executive disorder, also have reading disorders. So there's a high degree of overlap between a lot of these disorders in our language. And I want you also to remember, and I want to reinforce this, you can have executive function problems and not have a diagnosis, and walk out of my office without one too. Other than today, we finally have one. With the newest iteration of the Diagnostic Bible, it's called frontal lobe dysfunction executive disorder, or something like that. They finally caught up with brain science. So when we were talking about educators being behind, even my field, in terms of diagnostically, has been behind what we've known about what's going on with the brain for a while. This is just some other examples. When you have problems with emotional control, you've got temper tantrums. You'll also, kids will tend to, how many people know that when you have an intense emotional reaction to something, the frontal regions of the brain, which are the area we think manages all of this stuff, disconnect. They literally disconnect from the rest of the brain. We got a couple that know it. So does a temper tantrum make sense to you now in terms of all of the crazy behavior? Think about it for a minute. If you think about, this has been known actually by law enforcement for a long time. What do they do when there's a hostage situation? What does the negotiating team do? Does anybody know? Yeah, they walk in, they establish a relationship, number one, primary. Because if you don't establish a relationship with somebody, they're not going to listen to anything you have to say anyway. And that's pretty tough in those circumstances. The next thing they do is they try and get the emotional level ratcheted down. Because if you can't get somebody out of that emotional state, you cannot get the problem-solving centers of the brain engaged. So one of the first things as a parent or a teacher that's really important is if you see somebody that starts to get upset and you know they've got executive function problems, is to basically throw water, not gasoline, on a burning fire. And as a parent, that can be really difficult to do. Given that you've had a bad day, they typically tend to act this stuff out at the end of the day, but it's critical. Even if you have to walk away and take a time out yourself to be able to come back and manage what's going on. Don't worry, they'll still be there. Unless they're an adolescent, they may leave. But it's much better in terms of trying to get things back under control, because then you can get them engaged in some kind of problem solving. Whereas if they're that upset, they're just done. And do people know why that happens? This is the crazy part. People who don't have enough dopamine in the brain when they get upset enough have a flood of dopamine in the frontal part of the brain. And dopamine is in the frontal part of the brain, essentially the braking fluid of the brain. It's a way to think about it. That's why it affects inhibition. It allows you to then start inhibiting behavior. But if you get too much of it, it shuts it completely off. So now you're running from the lizard brain, and that's not really good, if anybody knows what I'm talking about. That's the inner emotional centers in the brain. Anybody ever, and I don't want to get too much into this, but anybody ever watch some of the political debates go on? Yeah, they're mostly losing their IQ points, and it's why most of the time they can't tell the truth or tell you what's really going on, and they get in those arguments because they're out of their problem-solving mode. The ones that tend to do better are the folks that can talk to each other in a calm, rational manner. All right, getting to the other question, and I'm going to press through some of this real quickly because we're beginning to run short on time. Shifting is mental flexibility. The ability to be able to manage demands and transition between activities. Or, and here's the hard one, when something happens externally that you do not expect to happen, and you can't make the shift to accept that what is going on externally is the reality of your world, and you're still trying to make what you expected to happen go on in your head. These are the kids that throw massive temper tantrums. Or say, I'm not going to do it. Does anybody know what this group is called diagnostically? And I hate this label. Oppositional defiant disorder. These kids are no more oppositional defiant disorder than you or I are. Basically what happens is something went wrong, something that they didn't expect to happen happened, they get stuck, people start applying pressure to them, they start to lose emotional control, and they dig in even deeper to their opposition at that point until you get into a major flaming temper tantrum battle, whatever's going to happen. I've seen kids actually hauled out of schools before by police officers because staff did not know how to handle these kind of kids at the high school level. Not so much at the elementary level. And you've seen them in the news every once in a while. They'll pop up. It's also associated with another famous disorder in my field, OCD. Those people have terrible trouble with mental flexibility. Very rigid thinking. There's one other group that you guys might see at lab school. You know who they are? They're famous for inflexibility. Yeah, autism spectrum. Yeah, have a lot of trouble with this. Let me run through this real quickly. This is a kid I saw whose mom basically wanted him to discontinue watching television to come to an appointment that was scheduled in my office? Yeah, it was great. And what the kid wrote was, "Why I am infuriated at you, picked me up early from daycare, you let me miss 16 minutes of my show, so I don't have no time for it," and I can't quite read what that says up there. But all of that's what, he just wrote this down, that's what's going on in his head. And that, which is the bad day, see the perseverative, the problem with shifting? Yeah, I mean, this was a great example that just spontaneously happened. See what happens when you keep pressing it? There's the explosion. And the interesting part is the conclusion is this kid went in his room, because it's what we've been working on him doing, is learning to take time out when he started to get this upset. That's why he actually drew all of this instead of actually blowing up, which was what was typical in his household. And that's what he wrote on the door, to keep his mom out, to give him the time basically to calm down. And because mom understood what was going on at that point, she let him alone, knew he was going to be okay, and they picked up and came to the office. They're about 15, 20 minutes late, but that's a whole lot better than what would have happened if they'd have gotten into it. They'd have never made it that day, more than likely, yes.
How does this relate to the Carol mindset theory, flexible, the fixed mindset versus flexible mindset?
Yeah, let me give you a resource that is the only one that I've ever seen work for kids that struggle with this particular set of executive functions, is Ross Greene's work on the cooperative problem-solving strategy. Ross Greene has done some work. I think he has a website called livesinthebalance.org that you can go look up on. It's a ton of information. But it's all about how you manage behavior with these kids. And let me run through these, because now we're into cognitive regulation. So does that help answer your question that you asked? What you do with them real quickly is you establish empathy. You must be frustrated with what I'm asking you to do. Once you get them calmed down, then you ask them to problem solve with you how to go about, they want to do whatever it is that they're doing, and you want them to do whatever the task you do. How can we make both of us happy so you try and come out of it with a win-win? That's how you manage these kids. That's the shorthand version of it. And that will fly against everything you guys probably have ever been taught as parents, but it's the only thing I've ever found that consistently works with these kids. The whole problem behind it, or the whole deal behind the cooperative problem solving, is you get them to move in a direction that may not be all of what you want, but at least some of it. And if you run into or encounter that kind of problem with a kid, typically my bet is that you're dealing with executive function issue. Because remember, my assumption with kids is kids are always going to want to please adults if they can. And there are exceptions to that rule. Let me run through the rest of these because we're starting to run short on time. See, I told you we'd never get to all of this. This is a huge area, by the way. Initiate is those kids that can't get started. So they require somebody to be with them to get them started. And usually once you get them started, they can then start sustaining effort to a task. Sometimes they can't do creative thinking if you're asking them to write a paper or solve a problem. And this stuff is in your notes also. So I'm going to run through these pretty quickly. This is actually an example of what motivates these kids. Yeah, they're procrastinators. They wait till the night before when they know they have to do it and they're in panic mode, and it's anxiety that usually gets them moving. And it's usually pretty intense. Working memory. Somebody asked me about this one. How do you know if it's working memory? Do you remember your question? Working memory, the best way to explain this is, if your job is to fill up your bathtub by taking a bowl of water from the sink and running it to the bathtub, and you are being graded on how fast you can do that, and you happen to have problems with working memory, you do not have a bowl, you have a sieve that you're running back and forth between the bathtub and the sink with. So that whatever you put in to memory leaks out by the time you get to the bathtub, and therefore you get a little bit in, but you don't get very much of it. These are kids that, for instance, can't complete 2 or 3 step, multi-step directions. They may do one of them, but they can't do 2 or they can't do 3, depending on how bad this is. The way to tell the difference between inhibition problems or them being distracted, which was, I think, part of the question, is if they can't get the one done and they get pulled off task to go do something else, you're probably dealing with an inhibition problem and not a working memory problem, although you could be. Because if you get the inhibition under control, so you put them in a distraction-free environment, and they still they can do one, but they can't do 2 or 3 steps, you probably got working memory problem. These are the kids that also, interestingly enough, to the speech and language question, develop reading disorders as they get older. Because how they show up as is not fundamental reading problems, which has to do with a completely different part of the brain, but they can't remember the information they're reading in the front part of the paragraph by the time they get to the bottom, so they can't comprehend what they're reading. So it's a disorder of the executive function that's creating that reading problem. Planning and organizing, basically the ability to organize information, organize your thinking, create a plan. This is what's helpful about actually verbalizing if you're working with a kid on a project. Okay, tell me what the steps are going to be. And if you get familiar enough with it, it is actually something that almost automatically with kids that have executive function problems run through in the office when we're trying to solve a problem, is verbalize it for them, get them to the point they'll verbalize it back to me, because the way to deal with executive function is you are actually helping these kids rewire their brains. So this is not about they don't want to comply, this is about helping create the neural substrate in the brain so they can actually do what we want them to do. So you're going to see in there some of the missed intervention is you can't just intervene with these kids once or twice and think you're done. This is a lot of work over a long period of time. They have to rehearse it. They have to grow the neurons in the brain. They have to develop the pathways. That's really what's going on behind the curtain, if you will. And it's a lot of work for them, and it's a lot of work for you guys. Okay, we've talked about monitoring. We've talked about organization. Here we go, changing behavior, magic, legend, hope, or science. Which is it? From my point, I'm going with science. Works better. Because that's what you're learning tonight, is that there is actually a science behind a lot of this misbehavior, dysfunctional behavior, dysregulated behavior. Our job as parents, teachers, and the adults in kids' lives is to be their frontal lobes till they can develop them. That's what we're here for, actually. Does that make sense to you? So one of the ways to think about what you do as a parent is you model it, you teach it, you rehearse it with them. Real quick, this is another one. I'm a big believer in the better way to change human behavior is to incentivize it, not to punish kids. And I will just give you 2 examples to go think about. Think about the stoplight system in Montgomery County. I think they have it in DC, where you get this nice little invitation if you break the rules to pay it's $40 in Montgomery County. I don't know what it is in DC. I've escaped getting one here. And think about the kinds of feelings that engenders in you when you receive it and how it affects your behavior. You slam on the brakes before you get to the traffic camera, you slow down. I've seen people go 10 miles an hour below the speed limit believing they get bonus points. Doesn't work. The other side, speed right back up. So there's 2 things it teaches parents. Behavior does suppress behavior when the punishment is severe enough, when you are present, and you have to be there 24/7 if you're going to really change behavior. That's a monumental task for a parent. However, if you incentivize people, think about what happens with the lottery system. And I'll shorten it. The lottery system is the government's way of making paying taxes fun. And people don't even realize they're paying taxes, but they do it. So if you incentivize people, you can get kids to do stuff that they don't think is fun, and you can make it fun for them if you figure out what the right incentive is. And the other notion behind this goal is, it is the world we live in. I have to go to work every day to get my incentives. You have to go to work every day. It's preparing them for living in an adult world. That old notion that somehow we're bribing kids, I don't think has any relevance. I don't think it's true. We're just beginning to teach them about the world we live in. And it actually works. We know that from science. With teenagers, we'll skip all this. You can see all this and there's one last thing. The Lessons of the Dancing Chicken, read that, because that has to do with how you change behavior very slowly by what's called shaping, or taking baby steps. If anybody saw the movie What About Bob? That's kind of old at this point. Same concept. Whoever wrote that book knew a lot about behavior change. With adolescents, what I would tell you is you have to accept the law of free will. You can't make them do anything. My particular approach to it is some kids sometimes need to fail, so you may have to allow them to experience a natural consequence, which would be getting a bad grade on something, rather than saving them from it, because that teaches them that other people are going to rescue them. So sometimes it's controlling our own anxiety about the fact they're not going to do well and letting them learn the lesson they need to learn and being available to them as a resource. I'm here to help you if you want it, if you need the help. So it's more learning how to team them or work with them kind of as a coach without trying to make them do things. I can get kids to do all kinds of things in my office that they would not normally do if I approached them and told them they had to do it. Because believe it or not, I'm wrapping up in just a second, believe it or not, inside of all of us exists a 5-year-old child. Nobody wants to be told what to do. Some people are really exquisitely sensitive to it and others aren't, and adolescence is one of those periods where they become exquisitely sensitive. So you can engage them, you just have to engage them differently. And the legend part is, then we were taught by our parents to do it because they didn't have access to all this stuff. We now have it, and these are really powerful tools to help us change human behavior. And have fun doing it and make your relationship with your kids better. That's the really cool part. So have fun using it. I'll be around to answer questions as people want to ask me. And thank you for having me.